There were dynamic and conflicting impulses that animated the women's rights movement in the 1850s. Personality clashes among participants had to be managed, but more important, an array of issues had surfaced about the political rights of women that ranged from voting to property holding to divorce. As Lucy Stone indicated in one of her letters, there was not a broad consensus, even among the leaders of the women's rights movement, whether all of these issues should be supported, and divorce was the most contentious issue of all. What precisely was the meaning of marriage? Should it be classified as one of the many contracts that individuals entered into and ended for good cause, or isolated as a spiritually privileged union never to be torn asunder? Marriage and the households constructed around it had been promoted for so long as fundamental to the political and moral order. What would happen if its contours were redefined as more of a contractual relationship between individuals? Lucy Stone's references in her letters to the masses and to voting rights are also telling. The government formed after the American Revolution had assumed a hierarchical system in which male property holders were expected to represent the best interests of society. Women did not vote in this system, but neither did many men. During the first decades of the 19th century, this view was dramatically refashioned as state after state rewrote their constitutions and in almost all cases gave the right to vote to white men without property. Andrew Jackson, a president of the United States from 1828 to 1836, symbolized this new political spirit, as did the new Democratic Party that formed around him. The Whig Party emerged a few years later in opposition to Jackson's policies, but with a keen appreciation for building a mass base of political support that could successfully challenge the Democrats. Both political parties courted votes with barbecues and torchlight parades, leading to boisterous new democracy that invited broader scrutiny about how political representation should be constructed. How were women to be represented in this new kind of government? Imagine the household as the basic political unit with an increasingly anachronistic concept. The many reform movements in which women were participating during this period had already raised questions about the extent to which they could extend their sphere, and these questions began to converge with new ones about whether or not successful reform would require the same political tools that had heretofore been the province of men. Thus, from many different directions, questions about how women would participate in their rapidly changing world necessarily arose. From questions of property holding to marriage to political participation, the rights of women as well as the rights of man demanded debate. The control of property was closely tied to the exercise of power in the new United States. Many believed that one of the main reasons to have a government was to protect property, and in the early years of the government, property was a necessary prerequisite for voting. These beliefs meshed well with a civil code that folded the legal identity of a wife into that of her husband, and a political system in which families were represented politically by the father, who was the head of the household. In this world, a household of representation, a husband's right to control his wife's property made perfect sense. However, this world of property ownership became the focus of reform efforts during the early 19th century, as both wealth and poverty exploded, and the economic risks faced by an emerging middle class threatened the stability of many families. Reforms in property laws, however, struck at the relations of power existing between men and women. The ideals of equality that had been raised in the revolutions of France and the United States were effectively channeled into narrow debates on political representation during the early 19th century. Radical proponents of early communitarian experiments decried this limitation, as they forcefully argued that true equality also demanded a more equitable distribution of wealth and an end to male dominance over women. Thinking about these issues emerged most clearly among the Owenites of England and the Fourierists of France, both of whom eventually established and inspired utopian communities in the United States. Robert Owen, leader of the Owenites, purchased an Indiana town of 30,000 acres of land and buildings in 1825 to showcase his ideas. Changing the name to New Harmony, Owen recruited residents to his model community. A decade later, followers of Charles Fourier established communities known as phalanxes in towns throughout New England and the Midwest. Fourierists and Owenites criticized the competitive spirit and physically degrading work regimes of early industrial capitalism, substituting instead a collective work ethic in which members of their communities pooled their resources and supported one another. They also viewed marriage and capitalism as parallel systems of oppression in which financial profits and women were both greedily sought as forms of prosperity. The wealthy unfairly exercised power over the poor, and men unfairly exercised power over women. True equality demanded an attack on marriage as well as property, because as Robert Owen argued, it was in marriage and through the family that men dominated the women who were their daughters and wives. New Harmony and dozens of other socialist communities experimented with a variety of ways to promote economic and gender equality. The attack on property meant that everyone at New Harmony received the same small allowance each week to spend at the company store. The minimal wages paid at Fourierist phalanxes even extended to payment for domestic chores, a revolutionary concept that recognized the economic value of housework. Attempts to create gender equality surfaced in ideas about clothing, property, and living arrangements. Women and men in New Harmony, for example, were encouraged to adopt an almost unisex clothing style that included trousers under a knee-length tunic for women. In many Fourierist phalanxes, where members bought into the community by purchasing stock, women as well as men were allowed to buy shares. Both Owenite and Fourierist communities also allowed women to vote on community matters, and in an attempt to limit the power of patriarchy and nuclear families, many communities constructed large structures to house most members of their groups, only reluctantly giving separate quarters to families who wished to live together. Indeed, both Robert Owen and Charles Fourier had originally suggested that their communities would promote a liberated sexual life in which the constraints of marriage would be eased. Fourier actually imagined a variety of sexual relationships that ranged from monogamy to polygamy to homosexuality and even to incest. However, in actual practice, the sex life in most of these communities was considerably more staid, as followers focused instead on issues of sociability, work, and governance. Many of the women who came to these communities, particularly single women, enjoyed the conviviality of communal households and the opportunities for independence they found. However, it was also clear that these communities were far from achieving the kind of gender equality they espoused, in part because communal leaders were still trapped in conventional expectations of male and female behavior. Although women in Fourierist phalanxes were supposed to be free to choose the work they did, most ended up doing traditionally female domestic work. It was revolutionary for phalanxes to pay women for their housework, but those who did housework received lower wages than those who did traditionally male work, such as blacksmithing or farming. The jobs apportioned to women in many Owenite communities were those traditionally associated with the domestic sphere, and in some communities, as wages became attached to labor, the work of men was valued as significantly higher wages than that of women. This was particularly problematic because the activities of the women, particularly cooking and child-rearing, were necessary and unrelenting, leading to a much harder workload for women than for men. Sarah Pears, for example, had come to New Harmony in 1825 with her husband and 7 children, hoping to find new opportunities after their grist mill in Kentucky had failed. She was unimpressed with the voting rights she was offered and appalled by the idea of wearing trousers, but she was most disappointed by the workload that she and her daughters faced in the new community. As she watched her older daughter Maria take on the heavy duties of washing laundry for the community, Sarah complained, quote, "All the hard work falls on Maria, and it is more than she can bear. We had hoped she would have been rather relieved from her heavy labor than otherwise by coming here, but at present it is far from the case." For Sarah Pears, New Harmony brought not an escape from domestic tyranny, but an expansion of it. Unable to solve problems of either class or gender inequality, and unable to sustain themselves economically, these communal experiments were fleeting. However, their attempts to link questions of gender inequality with economic inequality, and their attempts to reformulate their structure of governance to include direct rights for all, raised important possibilities for future thought. While communitarians tried to restructure both property and gender relations, Many other Americans confronted questions about women and property in a more prosaic way through the passage of married women's property laws. During the antebellum period, one legislature after another passed laws that increasingly gave married women ownership of their property that they had brought into marriage. While this legislation would eventually become a rallying point for women's rights activists, the roots of this movement had far more to do with protecting family legacies in a volatile market economy than it did with women's rights. The movement for married women's property laws was rooted in a legal loophole that wealthy families had exploited for years. Families could establish a separate estate for a married woman that her husband could not control. This was a particularly useful instrument if a son-in-law or potential son-in-law was viewed as ne'er-do-well of some sort. When Agnes Ruffin of Virginia hitched herself to T. Stanley Beckwith in 1838, for example, her father, Edmund Ruffin, watched with dismay and anger as his son-in-law contracted debts to cover his failing medical practice and patent medicine ventures. Ruffin had no intention of letting a man he considered shiftless and lazy get his hands on Agnes's inheritance. So when he divided his property among his children, he left Agnes a farm, 10 slaves, and railroad stock in a separate estate that her brother controlled for her. Agnes's inheritance was safe from her husband's clutches, but she was hardly financially independent as a result. Her financial fortunes were simply controlled by 2 different men rather than simply one. Of course, the goal was not to promote female independence, but to protect family property, and by extension the well-being of the family. Given the volatility of the antebellum economy, even husbands found the creation of separate estates for their wives to be desirable in many cases, realizing that should disaster strike their businesses, assets that were held in their wives' names would be beyond the reach of creditors. The married women's property laws that began to be passed by state legislatures in the 1830s were originally meant to eliminate the complicated legal proceedings that were required to set up such estates and to make the benefits of separate estates available to all women with property. In many cases, they also were part of a more widespread movement to enact bankruptcy legislation after the Panic of 1837. During the panic, the banking system of the United States collapsed, leaving many businessmen and farmers in debt with little recourse to pay their creditors and no ability to protect their families. Legislatures scrambled to pass laws that set up bankruptcy proceedings and abolished imprisonment for debts. The first married women's property law was passed in Mississippi in 1839, allowing women to keep both the property they brought to the marriage and property they individually inherited after their marriage, including slaves. Women were not allowed to keep any money they earned, however, nor did they have the right to control their property. Their husbands were expected to make all management decisions concerning the use of their wives' property. A Michigan law passed in 1844 simply stated that creditors could not seize a wife's property to pay her husband's debts. As state constitutions were formed in the newly organized territories of the West, protections of women's properties were included there as well. Married women received protections from the California Constitution in 1849, the Oregon Constitution in 1857, and the Kansas Constitution in 1859. Most states offered some form of married women's property law by the end of the Civil War. The need to pass married women's property acts derived not only from concerns about a more volatile market economy, but also in response to conquest and acquisition of vast amounts of territory previously held by France and Spain. Under Spanish law, a woman did not merge her legal identity with that of her husband. She was allowed to own her own property, prosecute her financial interests in court, and shield her assets from her husband's creditors. As territories from the Spanish Empire were incorporated into the United States, many of these property arrangements were preserved. Territorial legislatures in Arkansas and Florida passed laws in 1835 continuing earlier policies that protected a woman's property from debts her husband had incurred prior to marriage. Shortly after Texas declared its independence from Mexico in 1836, the Lone Star Legislature incorporated Spanish law on women's property holding into their new constitution. While some activists seized on this connection as an entering wedge in debating women's equality with men, others studiously avoided connecting the question of property with the question of rights. Sarah Josepha Hale, editor of Godey's Ladies' Book, ignored Hertel's argument about voting, even as she lent support to his goals of female property holding in the pages of her magazine. Hale would never support voting rights for women, and she eschewed any notion that women deserved equality to men. Instead, Hale legitimized her support for property laws by arguing that women needed this legislation to protect their separate sphere. Marriage without property protection for wives was slavery in Hale's view. Hertel's bill did not pass, but over the next decade, the issue surfaced repeatedly in the New York legislature, receiving support both from advocates for women like Hale, who emphasized their separate spheres, and from those like Ernestine Rose, who emphasized their shared rights with men. While legislatures scrambled to pass legislation to protect the property that women brought into marriages, they were far less enthusiastic about recognizing a woman's right to another form of her property, her labor. In most states, husbands retained the legal right to their wives' wages before the Civil War. Only Massachusetts passed an Earnings Act in 1855. In part, this lack of agitation may have been due to the fact that widespread wage earning was a fairly recent phenomenon, not only for women but also for men. Moreover, many married women who were paid a wage, such as shoebinders in Lynn, Massachusetts, saw themselves as contributing to a family economy and thus did not see themselves as independent wage earners. Their earnings, like those of their husband and children, were meant to be shared. This new world of female wage work meant that women also had to contend with another form of discrimination. They were paid less than men. Working men who criticized the lower wages paid to women saw this more as an injustice to men than to women. They argued that women were dragging down wages for men by working for so little. Employers, of course, exploited the fact that they could pay women less than men for the same work, and some women, in order to find employment, took what they could get. Working women began to challenge this injustice as early as the 1830s. When the tailoresses in New York City went on strike in the spring of 1831, the secretary of their society, Louise Mitchell, demanded to know why women were paid less than men. When we complain to our employers and others of the inequality of our wages with that of the men's, the excuse is they have families to support, from which females are exempt. As Mitchell pointed out, though, this was poor reasoning. How many females are there who have families to support, and how many single men who have none, and who, having no other use for the fruits of their employer's generosity, they childlike waste it? Some of these seamstresses may well have been inspired by Fanny Wright, the socialist and reformer who had lectured to large audiences during this period. At one point, Wright had argued that women were an economic underclass in society, forced to depend on the larger salaries of men for survival, either as housewives or prostitutes. A decade later, Ellen Monroe made a similar criticism in the Boston Bee, with stinging prose that was reprinted in the labor newspaper of Lowell, the Voice of Industry. Mocking the claims of men that they were the general protectors of women, Monroe directed their attention to the thousands of women doomed to lives of miserable drudgery and receiving a compensation which, if quadrupled, would be rejected by the man laborer with scorn. The factory workers in Lowell may have been particularly interested in Monroe's argument. Inspired by their correspondence with French immigrant Angelique Martin, a strong women's rights advocate and a communitarian reformer from Marietta, Ohio, the working women of Lowell had hired a lecturer on women's rights. The sporadic complaints voiced by working women about inequitable wages converged with similar concerns raised by anti-prostitution reformers in the 1840s. Female moral reform societies had begun to link prostitution with economic distress rather than moral depravity. Like many middle-class reformers, they criticized the pitiful wages of seamstresses and tailoresses and demanded to know how these women could support themselves. Groups as far away as Oregon began to demand better compensation for female wage workers. Those who fought against wage discrimination, like those who fought for a married woman's right to own property, did so for many different reasons. They were not part of a unified women's movement. They were, however, all part of a dynamic and volatile capitalist economy in which economic relations were being radically transformed. Businesses could easily go bankrupt, and employers looking for every opportunity to cut wages in order to make a profit. Regardless of what their ideals of domesticity were, women were a part of this new economic world. Whether as wage earners or wives, they were increasingly economic individuals in need of legal protections independent of their husbands and fathers. While controlling property and wages represented one set of issues confronted by women in the antebellum period, defining the nature of the domestic sphere represented another. This was an issue that struck at the heart of the contemporary organization of power, for it was the husband who represented his family to the state on the one hand, and who ruled his wife and children on the other. Redefining the relations of power within that sphere thus carried tremendous implications. The educational responsibilities of women, tied to their role as mothers, were promoted in a growing number of ambitious educational ventures. At the same time, the legal bonds of matrimony were re-examined as the grounds for divorce in many states were broadened. While women continued to be legally incorporated within their husbands' identities, the extent of their domestic sphere was expanding, and the relations of power within their domestic world were being challenged. The seminary movement that began after the Revolution blossomed during the 19th century. Emma Willard became a particularly powerful leader with the Troy Female Seminary in upstate New York, where students studied algebra, geometry, physics, history, and geography. Lucy Larcom, who had worked in the Lowell Mills, traveled west to Illinois to attend Monticello Seminary. It was worthwhile for me to go to those western prairies, if only for the broader mental view that opened upon me there, she recalled. Describing her trepidation at facing demanding mathematics courses and the rigor of her history and philosophy classes, Lucy credited the lady principal who taught many of these subjects with getting her through. She was surely one of my strong guiding angels sent to me as I went to meet her upon my life road, Lucy concluded. Female academies and colleges proliferated in the South even more than in the North during the antebellum period. The elite young women who attended these schools sometimes studied classical languages such as Greek that were more commonly the provinces of men's colleges. They also took on science, mathematics, and history. For Southern women, the mastery of such subjects was a mark of class distinction, evidence of their family's wealth and status. Parents thus embraced the opportunity to provide their daughters with a higher education if they could afford it, because they felt it would make their daughters more desirable when the time came for them to marry. In the North, women were educated not only to mark their status, but more often to provide them with training in case they needed to support themselves. Emma Willard had always imagined her students could become teachers, even though men dominated the teaching profession at the time. Catherine Beecher raised the stakes by arguing that teaching should become a woman's profession. After running her Hartford Female Seminary during the 1820s, Beecher began to formulate an argument that this kind of rigorous education fitted women to properly extend their sphere from teaching their own children to teaching others as well. Mary Lyon, who founded Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in 1837, focused on the creation of Christian missionaries who would use their training to both convert and civilize the world. These northern seminaries produced a more independent woman than the southern seminaries did. But almost all of the leaders of this movement were at great pains to avoid pushing too far beyond the bounds of woman's sphere. Emma Willard was adamant about avoiding direct involvement in political affairs, as was Mary Lyon. Catherine Beecher anguished over the problem, becoming perhaps the most vociferous opponent of political activism at the same time that she secretly engaged in it with the campaign against Indian removal. Overall, these schools worked hard to create an expanded woman's sphere rather than a challenge to women's spheres, though some of their students used their education for more radical purposes. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the most famous of the women's rights activists, graduated from Emma Willard Seminary. Moreover, despite the commitment to motherhood, women who graduated from Troy Female Seminary and Mount Holyoke in the antebellum period were less likely to marry than their peers, evidence of independence their teachers had not anticipated. Students in female academies demonstrated the intellectual capabilities of women, and their success encouraged women to seek higher degrees that challenged traditional boundaries between male and female education. As colleges experimented with co-education and as women demanded postgraduate training, the boundaries of women's sphere were repeatedly questioned. One of the first places women confronted these barriers was at Oberlin College in Ohio. Oberlin opened in 1833 with a revolutionary commitment to educating not only men and women together, but also black and white students together. Inspired by the fires of the Second Great Awakening, Oberlin was the first great experiment in co-education, though many other small private institutions and public colleges set up by the states would soon follow suit. However, while Oberlin was coeducational, women there soon encountered and challenged some of the assumptions about separate spheres built into its curriculum. Men and women at Oberlin attended the same courses and ate together in the dining halls, where the ideal of civilized discourse between the sexes was enshrined. However, men and women used the library at different times, and more problematic, women were expected to receive a different college degree. The ladies' course, which was eventually renamed the literary course, did not demand the same level of competence in classical languages as did the bachelor degree that men received. Women at Oberlin who entered with training in classical languages quickly complained, and within a decade of its founding, Oberlin was awarding its AB degrees to women who qualified, while continuing to offer the ladies' course to most of the women at the school. Even more troubling was the demand one early graduate, Antoinette Brown, made to become an ordained minister. Women at Oberlin received theological training to become the wives of ministers, not ministers themselves, and Brown's dogged pursuit of her own pulpit raised hackles around campus. The Ladies' Board, which was responsible for the education of women at Oberlin, tried to dissuade Brown. Brown persevered, but when she completed her studies and asked to be licensed as a preacher, the college committee refused. Brown became an active speaker on behalf of religious and reform causes, but ordination was an elusive and difficult goal. She was finally called in 1853 to a small parish in upstate New York, but even then, local congregational ministers refused to participate in the ordination ceremony. Women could function as informal traveling preachers, but Brown's challenge made it clear that recognition among the regulars was a different matter. Brown's challenge to the theological establishment and the schools it controlled was echoed in the attempts of women to become doctors. This was particularly clear in the experience of Brown's sister-in-law, Elizabeth Blackwell. Blackwell applied for admission to Geneva Medical College in New York in 1847 after having attended a course of medical lectures in Cincinnati. It was the only medical college that would take her, and that occurred in part because the male students, viewing the possibility more as a joke than a real possibility, voted to let her in. Soon after she received her medical degree, Geneva instituted a new policy that forbade the admission of women. Most other medical schools followed the lead. Keeping the regular medical profession male was one of the ways doctors sought to establish their legitimacy and to distinguish themselves amidst the broad array of midwives, botanists, and irregularly trained doctors in the country. The medical education of women, however, attracted support from a variety of quarters for different reasons. Most women, including Blackwell, argued that providing medical relief had long been the province of women, and that women needed female doctors to attend them. Sarah Josepha Hale argued that it was part of the woman's sphere to attend to the sick, and that no one but a woman should be examining another woman's body. With such issues as female propriety and tradition to back them up, medical study could well be argued to be a natural extension of the woman's sphere. Formal medical training had been the province of men, however, and it was hard to avoid the egalitarian implications of offering women this sort of training. Because medical schools were slamming their doors shut to women, supporters of regularly trained female doctors began to organize medical schools for women. The Female Medical College of Pennsylvania was established by the Quakers in Philadelphia in 1850, and the New England Female Medical College in Boston was chartered in 1856. Blackwell herself, along with her sister Emily, who also became a doctor, opened the Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary in 1868. Divorce laws had been liberalized in the early republic following the Revolution. However, divorce was still difficult to obtain, and women in particular felt that burden. A person had to petition the state legislature for a divorce, a process that required both money and influence. Given the difficulty of such proceedings, many unhappy couples found that a more informal tactic worked better. One of the partners just moved. This was a solution that only worked, however, when there was no property at stake or one of the partners was willing to relinquish his or her claim to it. Frontier areas such as Texas were filled with men and women who had left behind unhappy marriages to make a fresh start. a situation that led to a surprisingly casual tolerance of bigamy. During the antebellum period, states in both the North and the South increasingly moved divorce proceedings out of the legislatures and into the courts, making them more routine and more accessible to residents. Pennsylvania began this trend in 1816. Even in the South, where colonial divorce laws had been stricter than in the North, all states except South Carolina had passed divorce laws that allowed courts to end marriages in particular circumstances. As a result of these changes, divorce became more common in the United States. In New Jersey, for example, only 13 divorces were granted between 1788 and 1799, roughly one per year, whereas in 1860 alone, 86 divorces occurred. Divorce became more accessible not only because it had become a matter for the courts rather than the legislature, but also because of the grounds for divorce being expanded in most states. One of the most important new criteria for divorce was that of mental cruelty. In a variety of states, legislators accepted the idea that a marriage could be intolerable as a result of not only physical abuse but also mental abuse. However, the courts had to give teeth to these laws, and many justices maintained a very high standard in judging mental cruelty. When Huldah Barber sued her husband Hiram for divorce in Ohio in 1846, the court accepted her contention of mental cruelty because not only had her husband humiliated her by charging her with sexual incapacity and forcing her to have a medical exam to prove it, but he had repeatedly tried to have sex with her daughter. The courts in Connecticut were considerably less open to mental cruelty pleas in a divorce case in which the wife claimed she had been forced by her husband to have sex repeatedly against her will. Describing her husband's actions as harsh, the court dismissed any notion of mental cruelty and argued that he was exercising his marital rights. In North Carolina, where local justices usually gave plaintiffs a sympathetic hearing, the Superior Court was far more strident and seldom granted divorce. As Judge Pearson explained when he overturned the divorce decree from a lower court of a woman whose husband had committed forgery, she agreed to take him, for better or worse. In addition to the problems associated with actually obtaining a divorce, women also faced hurdles in maintaining their relationships with their children after divorce. Courts in the 19th century did increasingly recognize the rights of mothers to custody rather than necessarily giving children to fathers as they would have done in the colonial period. This was due not to ideas of women's rights, but to women's nurture, that women were the more natural protectors of children. In one case, a New Jersey court even awarded custody to a woman in 1813 who had left her husband for her lover. The court cited the need of the children for their mother's nurture and pointed out that while the mother had behaved badly towards her husband, she had been exemplary in her treatment of her children. However, the courts were much less likely to recognize women's ability to control the legal or financial aspects of their children's lives. Fathers were the ones who were expected to control the property of children, even if the former wives were the nurturers. The debate about women's property rights, women's education, and what constituted legitimate grounds for divorce took on heightened significance in the volatile world of reform and democratic politics. In a variety of forums, from temperance to anti-slavery, women were working to shape public policy in a political world that was rapidly changing. One state after another held constitutional conventions in the antebellum period to ratify new documents defining the precise nature of their polity. Old patterns of political hierarchy and deference were being swept away as voting rights were extended to the masses. How would the views of women be represented in this new democratic world? As these questions were debated, two broad lines of reasoning about women's rights emerged. One focused on the difference between men and women, stressing that separate spheres and complementary roles, while the other focused on the shared characteristics of the two sexes and egalitarianism in their relationships. Those who focused on differences saw women exercising power in society through influence, advising their husbands, educating their children, and providing an exemplary model of virtue in their behavior. They continued the tradition that underlay the celebration of Republican womanhood at the end of the 18th century. Those who focused on egalitarianism stressed rights over influence. They began to articulate a philosophy that stressed direct relationships between women and the state, women and their property, and women and their employers. In doing so, they laid claim to the tradition of natural rights that had been claimed by men during the Revolution. While continuing to champion the value of the women's sphere, they nonetheless discounted it as a route to power, arguing instead that women needed to exercise power as men did through political and economic rights. This philosophy would become most clearly articulated in the women's rights movement of the 1850s, but the outlines were becoming clear by the 1830s. The different philosophies inherent in the influence versus rights approaches crystallized in the mid-1830s as Catherine Beecher conducted a 2-year-long pamphlet debate with the Grimke sisters about their anti-slavery activities and, more broadly, the proper relationship of women to a political question. Although Beecher opposed slavery, she was outraged by the appeal to the women of the nominally free states penned by Angelina Grimke in 1836, which not only attacked the religious and legal defenses of slavery, but also urged women to combat it by petitioning the government. Are we aliens because we are women? Angelina Grimke demanded. Are we bereft of citizenship because we are the mothers, wives, and daughters of a mighty people? Have women no country? Although Grimke did not demand the right to vote for women, she potentially noted that the American Revolution had been fought over the problem of taxation without representation, and that single women in the 19th century faced exactly the same problem. They had to pay taxes on their property, but they had no voice in the government. As Angelina Grimke embarked on a speaking tour of northern cities in 1837 to rouse women to the cause of abolition, Beecher penned her first volley in the attack on the Grimke sisters' public speaking and political agitating, an essay on slavery and abolitionism with reference to the duty of American females. Beecher saw little hope in the factionalism, patronage, and torchlight parade politics that the Democrats and Whigs had created. Ignoring her own role a few years earlier in the petitioning campaigns against Indian removal, she argued instead that women needed to hold themselves above the fray, promoting their political ideals through the influence they wielded in their homes. Beecher's view was a hierarchical one in which women were subordinate to men, but also powerful within this hierarchy. She did not feel that women should divorce themselves from all knowledge of politics, but that they should engage it within their homes. In their counter to Beecher's attack, Angelina and Sarah Grimke stressed the importance of women responding the same way as men to the world's problems, because both were endowed with the same souls and moral capacities. The Grimke sisters thus advanced a kind of natural rights argument, one that stressed the shared spiritual characteristics of men and women. However, their natural rights theory was legitimated not by reference to social contract, which was commonly imagined to have been made by men, but by reference to God. The natural rights of women were both sacred and inalienably hers. Angelina Grimke published her response in Letters to Catherine Beecher, which focused mostly on the immorality of slavery. Even more famous, however, was Sarah Grimke's defense in a series of essays for the New England Spectator and the Liberator, which were gathered together and reprinted as letters on the equality of the sexes. Sarah Grimke argued powerfully for the equality of women and men before God, challenging biblical translations that suggested women were inferior to men. By the 1850s, many moral reform causes were moving out of the realm of moral suasion and into the realm of legislative initiative. Whether fighting for temperance or chastity, or even more explosively an end to slavery, reformers began to seek political solutions to problems that had been the target of their moral reform concerns during the 1830s and 40s. Women who wanted to continue pushing for those reforms had to come to terms with this new political world and figure out how they were going to be a part of it. The beginnings of this move towards political involvement lay in the petition campaigns of the antebellum period. In protesting Indian removal, slavery, and labor conditions, women had affixed their names as individuals to political causes and sought political solutions to these problems. They passed petitions among their friends, and they also knocked on the doors of strangers and submitted their petitions in the impersonal halls of legislature. The petition campaigns continued to expand to other reform efforts, and reformers increasingly sought legislative solutions. Of course, elite women had always had informal access to political leaders. If they were not married to them, they socialized with them, sitting at dinner, contributing financially to their campaigns, and facilitating introductions. These women effectively utilized informal networks to lobby effectively for their benevolent causes, local orphanages, schools, and other worthy venues. Many of the women who became involved in more radical and national causes, however, did not have this kind of access. They usually did not have the same social connections, and their causes were far more controversial. If they wanted to reach politicians, they had to rely on more public methods. By the end of the 1840s, as moral reforms stalled and political participation was defined increasingly in terms of the vote, it was difficult to ignore politics as an arena of potential change. The Liberty Party, which was established in 1840, established an anti-slavery beachhead in the political system. The Free Soil Party, established in 1848 and largely incorporated into the Republican Party in 1854, continued this trend. Temperance also became more of a political issue in the 1850s, as laws against the sale and consumption of alcohol were debated. If women wanted to continue to provide leadership in these movements, they would have to come to terms with the political world in which their causes were now being agitated. The movement for women's rights emerged in the 1850s. As Americans of all stripes debated ideas of citizenship and worried about the protection of their rights. Not only were established states rewriting their constitutions, new states were conceiving of theirs as they sought entry into the Union. The Dred Scott decision focused national attention on the Supreme Court decision in 1857 that a slave could not be a citizen. Both Northerners and Southerners were increasingly suspicious that their rights were being trampled by each other's demands. The women's movement, however, focused attention on how rights were affected by gender rather than by race or region. Composed of a very small group of devoted supporters, the movement was a regional one in some important respects. It never gained any support in the South, for example. Yet because it took on the issue of what a government should be, it had national implications. And as correspondence with supporters abroad made clear, the women's movement in the United States was part of a larger set of concerns about the shape of governments of Western Europe as well. The debate over women's rights versus women's influence took an important turn in July of 1848. Approximately 300 women and men packed the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York, to self-consciously proclaim a long list of women's rights. They were Northerners, many of them tied together by shared struggles in the abolitionist movement. The New York legislature had finally passed a Married Women's Property Act in 1848, inspiring Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Martha C. Wright, Mary Ann McClintock, and Jane Hunt to plan a meeting to discuss additional issues related to women. Stanton drafted 11 resolutions for debate in a Declaration of Sentiments, a document that bore more than a passing resemblance to the Declaration of Independence. The convention and its resolutions signaled the way in which the organizers hoped to reconstitute the government of the United States around issues that would include women rather than exclude them. The audacity of such a move was clear. Although Mott and Stanton were veteran reformers, they still hesitated to chair the meeting, so that James Mott, Lucretia's husband, presided over the event. The issues that have been swirling around the civic identity of women for the past several decades finally came to a boil. Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions asserted that all men and women had been created equal as its most basic principle, and then articulated 18 ways in which men had injured women and usurped their rights, including their property, their wages, and their civil identity in marriage. The imposition of a double standard of morality, discrimination in marriage and divorce, and taxing women without allowing them a voice in the government. Arguing that women had a natural right to equality with men, the convention debated 11 resolutions attached to the Declaration of Sentiments that asserted the equality of women with men, the right of women to speak in church and in public, and the right to equal participation in trade and commerce. The most controversial of these resolutions by far was the one that stated, quote, "It is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise." While Stanton's convictions on this score had been clear for several years, many of her fellow reformers were still shocked. Some were personally opposed to the idea of women voting. Others felt that such a radical demand would undermine the movement. Debate on the issue was overheating when the abolitionist and reformer Frederick Douglass rose to speak passionately in defense of women's suffrage. The balance tipped and the resolution passed. From that time forward, suffrage became a defining issue of the women's rights movement, though it was far from the only concern. Another small convention was held a few weeks later in Rochester, and soon plans were afoot for a national convention. Throughout the 1850s, national conventions were held yearly in locations that ranged from Philadelphia, Worcester, and New York to Akron and Cincinnati, Ohio. These meetings often drew thousands of participants in rather boisterous circumstances as reformers of all stripes took to the floor and as rowdies and hecklers sought to disrupt debate. Rising above the pandemonium, however, was the sense that just as an earlier convention had legitimated the U.S. Constitution, and just as many states were convening conventions to debate revisions to their own constitutions, a new voice of the people would be heard in the National Women's Rights Convention. How could the legitimacy of rule be established, after all, without the consent of the people? The women's rights movement during the 1850s was neither tightly organized nor unified. Supporters struggled and differed over a variety of issues that tried to reconcile the problem of what it meant to be both a woman and a citizen at the same time. Convention debates, rather than a clearly structured platform, provided the intellectual core to the movement. Both within these conventions and in response to them, women's rights advocates explored a variety of issues that were specific to confronting how a woman should go about being a citizen. The women's rights conventions that took place during the 1850s repeatedly called for access to education and stressed the importance of women controlling their own property. They demanded citizenship and they demanded the vote. In doing so, they still maintained a belief in the importance of a woman's separate sphere and upheld her responsibilities to domesticity. Their view of rights, by and large, still accepted a belief in gender difference. They wanted equality with men, but not sameness. They wanted a state that recognized the issues that had been raised during the previous half-century about a woman's place in public and the political sphere. In raising these issues, they distinguished themselves from those who saw the route to women's power in influence rather than rights. But they also had to think about gender inequality in relationship to problems that women in particular faced. One of the earliest questions many reformers tackled was that of dress. The heavy skirts that middle-class women were expected to wear were expensive, uncomfortable, and unhealthy, with waists tightly cinched by constricting corsets. Thus, women's rights activists took notice when the famous actress Fanny Kimball donned male attire in 1849. Amelia Bloomer, editor of the temperance journal The Lily, championed the loose-fitting trousers and long tunic. Although a variety of women's rights activists, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, adopted the new style, the publicity generated by The Lily's editor led to the outfit being called bloomers. Proponents of bloomers pointed out that women could be able to conduct household chores and take vigorously healthy walks far more easily than with the new style. Although the outfits were quite different from what men wore at the time, they did more closely approximate male dress and provided many of the same physical freedoms associated with male clothing. This challenge to gender distinctions, however, brought down a hailstorm of criticism on women who tried to wear the outfits. Newspapers across the country ridiculed the women for their manly costume. Children followed them in the streets, harassing them and calling them names. The symbolism of dress was so powerful and so volatile it was impossible for women to adopt it, even if it was more comfortable and healthy. By the middle of the 1850s, dress reform advocates were ready to give up. The criticisms from the press and the conflicts within the movement over appropriate attire were too exhausting. Their decision to abandon dress reform, however, was not without consequences. Gerrit Smith, a wealthy abolitionist, was so dismayed over the loss of dress reform as a cause that he ceased funding the national conventions. This is one of the reasons a national convention was not held in 1857. Women also had to confront the long-standing tradition that associated female public speaking with moral turpitude. Most women's rights activists had thrown aside their reservations about public speaking by the middle of the 1850s, but that did not mean that they were comfortable with speaking or that they were particularly good at it. At the Syracuse Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton objected to the leadership of Elizabeth Oakes Smith because she lacked a powerful speaking voice. Stanton argued that a woman should not be allowed to address the audience unless her voice was loud enough to be heard by everyone in the hall. Paulina Wright Davis was outraged by Stanton's motion and urged the convention not to gag any of the women present. Davis also went further in 1852, using her wealth to establish a newspaper, the Una, that would provide an alternative public sphere to the boisterous conventions that were the focus of organizing. The issue of the women's rights movement grew not only from the potent convergence of questions of citizenship and differences, but also from issues articulated in debates over slavery. Many of the men and women who participated in the women's rights movement came out of the abolitionist movement. Lucy Stone and Lucretia Mott, for example, were important anti-slavery lecturers. Susan B. Anthony helped slaves escape on the Underground Railroad. Their consciousness about discrimination against women had been raised through their anti-slavery experiences, as they increasingly compared the condition of women to the condition of slaves. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott had famously formed their friendship and begun to contemplate the issue of women's rights at the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, when female delegates such as Mott were rejected from participation and speaking. The issue of women's leadership had precipitated the split in the American anti-slavery movement. Just as anti-slavery activists had debated whether to support women's rights activists debated whether to support anti-slavery. Jane Swisshelm, a women's rights activist in particular, provoked controversy by arguing that the women's rights movement was not strong enough to bear the burden of anti-slavery agitation as well. She criticized participants of the 1850 Worcester Convention for introducing slavery into their debate. Despite Swisshelm's comments, African American women did cross over from abolitionism to support women's rights. Harriet Fortin Purvis and Margaretta Fortin were two of the lead organizers of the Fifth National Women's Rights Convention in Philadelphia in 1854. Nancy Prince, one of the first African American authors, attended the convention, where she addressed the audience on the way slavery degraded African American women. Sarah and Charles Redmond, a brother and sister from Boston, also took up the case, as did Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Many of the African American activists were particularly prominent in pushing women not only to demand rights, but also to disregard ideas about the woman's sphere that essentially limited the rights of women. As Mary Ann Shadd Cary and her sister Amelia Shadd argued in their newspaper, women's work was anything she put her mind or her hand to. Sojourner Truth, the most famous African American woman to participate in the women's rights movement, continued the argument of these African American activists about disregarding the woman's sphere. Truth, whose real name was Isabella Van Wagenen, had been born a slave in New York and freed when slavery was abolished in 1825. Her white colleagues worried at first about having her speak at their conventions, fearing both her illiteracy and her commitment to abolitionism. However, Truth was a powerful orator whose speeches brought audiences to their feet cheering. Her most famous speech at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851 has been the subject of some debate. Not all of those who reported it remembered her saying, "Aren't I a woman?" as Frances Gage claimed she had, but they do agree on the gist of her message: she could do as much as any man. As Marius Robinson reported at the time, Truth argued, "I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too." African American women understood the importance of separate spheres in definitions of respectability, but they had to violate its terms much more obviously and regularly than middle-class white women. Whether in wage earning, in property holding, or in heading their own households, African American women had shouldered burdens as great as their menfolk, and they brought that understanding with them into the struggle for women's rights. The most contentious conflict among women's rights activists was over divorce. Some of the more radical supporters of the temperance movement had been pushing to liberalize divorce laws for over a decade, arguing that women and children should not have to live in a house with a drunkard. In this sense, divorce legislation was very much a woman's issue, tied to her distinctive position within the home as both a dependent of her husband and nurturer of her children. But marriage was also a legal contract between two freely consenting individuals. In this sense, it was a question of citizenship. Framing marriage as a contract, however, moved it into a category of business relationships that scandalized even the most dedicated of women's rights activists. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been one of the most ardent supporters of liberalizing divorce laws for the wives of drunkards, but as she argued for changing divorce laws, her arguments moved beyond protecting wives from drunken husbands to a more dramatic revisioning of marriage as a contract between two individuals rather than a sacred bond. Marriage reform, she argued, was of central importance in creating a society based on equality, for in marriage, men had the right to dominate their wives. The issue came to a head at the 1860 Women's Rights Convention. Brushing aside the concerns of Lucy Stone that her goals were premature, Stanton demanded in her address, how can she, woman, endure our present marriage relations by which woman's life, health, and happiness are held so cheap that she herself feels that God has given her no charter of rights, no individuality of her own? Stanton's speech sparked a wrenching controversy at the convention. Ernestine Rose, who stood shoulder to shoulder with Stanton on the divorce issue, argued that it was a question of rights. The state had an obligation to protect its citizens, even if it meant abrogating a marriage contract. Antoinette Brown Blackwell struck back, defending marriage as a sacred institution. Even if a woman had to protect herself from a drunken husband by obtaining a divorce, Blackwell argued that the man and woman would still be married in the eyes of God, and that the divorced wife should still recognize the spiritual connection. Wendell Phillips, a famous abolitionist and supporter of women's rights, was so appalled by Stanton's position that he wanted the entire discussion struck from the convention's proceedings. Phillips argued that men and women were treated equally under laws of marriage, so that marriage reform was not really a proper topic for the women's movement. The focus, he argued, should be on areas such as political rights where women were truly discriminated against. The debate over divorce was the last big debate to take place in the women's rights movement of the 1850s. Women's rights activists were almost all deeply committed anti-slavery activists as well. Sectional tensions between the North and the South had begun growing during this time period. With the outbreak of the Civil War in 1860, reformers turned their attention wholeheartedly to the conflict that was tearing the nation apart. The women's rights movement of the 1850s challenged fundamental beliefs about the household as the basic political unit of government, stirring bitter debate about how women could be citizens in the democratic government that had developed in the United States. Proponents of women's influence had pushed the limits of the domestic sphere to encompass a broad range of educational and economic demands, even as they shunned agitation for the vote. Proponents of women's rights, although acknowledging the difference between men and women, had struggled with a more radical agenda that would allow women autonomy in the control of their property, their education, and their political representation. But even among women's rights activists, there were differences, most particularly around the issue of marriage and divorce. With the coming of the Civil War, women's rights activists postponed these pressing discussions about the legal rights of women in both the state and the family.